Hey, welcome to episode 7 of Track Records with your hosts Kenny and Barry. And Barry, do you want to start off with Barry's corner, or do you want to pick up where we left off last talk?
Um, let's pick up where we left off. And the last episode, we were talking about bands who we were originally talking about bands who had never put out a real shit bag of a record. So, um, like throughout the length of their career, they put out, say, at least six records, and all of them were fantastic. And some of the bands we mentioned, or some of the bands I had mentioned, were like Funkadelic, Midnight Oil, Luna, Nick Cave, Radiohead, et cetera, et cetera. We already touched base on all those bands, but another thing that that conversation led into is bands who had put out at least a run of six great records. So maybe they put out a bunch of shitty records as well, but at one point they put out six records in a row that were just incredible. And the Ramones were one of the bands that we had just started to talk about that fall into that category. At least for me, they do.
Right. And what I was mentioning when we were talking about the Ramones, and I agree that was a great run of records, but it was not the Mount Olympus run of records. And when I talk about that, that's what I mean, like the Stones run of four albums with Let It Bleed, Beggar's Banquet, Sticky Fingers, and Exile, or Dylan's with Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde, or and so those are like that, having that sort of run like that to me is way different than what the Ramones did. Okay, not to diminish what the Ramones did.
So let's just look at those Ramones records.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got the first one, right? Ramones.
Yeah.
Second one, Leave Home. Third one, Rocket to Russia. Fourth one, Road to Ruin. So you're saying at least one of those records is subpar,
Not
or
subpar, not big difference between subpar and Mount Olympus. Okay, no one would talk about any of those Ramones records as one of the greatest records of all time.
I think I think people would certainly talk about that first one as one of the greatest rock records of all time.
Compared to something like Exile and Main Street.
Well, yeah, yeah,
Wow.
because there's a lot of people who are more into the punk rock side of things, and that first Ramones record in particular, I think, is regarded by many to be as good as Exile and Main Street in the confines or in the context of punk rock.
Okay, I'll have to go and give another listen to that. It's been a while since I've listened to it, and as you know, because I do stream rather than listen to vinyl, I tend to listen to Ramones songs here or there as opposed to an album. So, but the great thing is I can just play the album. The cool thing about streaming is, and we'll talk more about this, but is that I basically have access to 80% of your entire record collection at my fingertips. And so
Yeah.
as soon as we're done, I can just listen to that, and to also to a portion of stuff that you don't have, like a huge number of stuff you
Oh
don't have.
no. Oh
So
no.
yes, sorry. Um, but the Ramones record, and I don't remember the track listing off the top of my head, but do you think that their first album is better than the Clash's first album?
Uh, I don't know if I would say it's better. It's apples and oranges to a degree, but I would say it's certainly in the same ballpark.
Because if you had argued that the Clash's first album against one of those Rolling Stones or Dylan records, I would be more on board with that. Although even then, I would still draw a line, but I would certainly be that is a fantastic debut album.
Agreed, agreed. And the second record, produced by my buddy Sandy Pearlman, also a great record, although that was
Give them enough rope. Yeah,
unfairly maligned for years and years.
yeah,
Because
I think it's a good album.
it's a great record. The
Yeah.
songs on it are great. It's just the production is so different than that first record. But what I was trying to get at is the Clash don't fall into this category because they didn't do six.
No. So
You know,
so there was their first record, The Clash, and then Give Them Enough Rope, and then London Calling,
Mhm.
and then What was after London Calling? What was the next record?
Well, there was the 10-inch EP Black Market Clash,
Right,
which
right.
is
No, that's
great in
good.
its
Yeah,
own
yeah, yeah,
right,
yeah. Absolutely. Yep.
and it's almost the length of a full record. Actually, it kind of is. I think there's 10 songs on it,
Mm.
or 8. And then after that was Sandinista and then Combat Rock.
Combat Rock is terrible. Sandinista, much like I talked about the River, if Sandinista had been a single album, that would have been a great album. If it had a double album, it would have been a very good album. As a triple album, it was a good album. There's too much stuff that's just. I mean, they did the album just to get out of their contract. That because
So
they owed CBS three records. That's why they did a 3 record set, and you can tell.
so I know what you're saying about Sandinista, and actually I have a bone to pick with you about Combat Rock even.
Okay.
But Sandinista, I know the knock on it is that it contains a lot of filler since it is 3 albums. I I don't think you need to cut any of it down because that was a Clash, broadening their horizons, experimenting, not always 100% successfully, but I think there's so many great songs on it, even the ones that you don't necessarily think of as great Clash songs. I love every bit of it.
You like the kids singing Hitsville, UK?
Totally, totally.
Okay.
It's so unusual, and they were so unafraid to try things. They were not stuck in a rut of like, oh well, we have to sound like our last record or our last 2 records. They were just trying stuff, seemingly at the drop of a hat, and all these different influences came in and impacted that record and the songs on that record. And I just love it. I've listened to it recently, whereas for many years I felt like you did about it, like, oh, it's a lot of filler. And but man, listening to it as an older person, as opposed to say a 18-year-old when it came out or however old, it's great, man. I love it.
Uh, I One of my favorite Clash songs is on there, which is "Somebody Got Murdered."
Yeah.
And I do, like I said, I like several of the songs. I do not like the whole album. And I think it would have been interesting. I agree. I like them being influenced by different things and showing the effect of those influences. But I'd be interested if it just been a single album or even a double album. I do think that a lot of their experimenting really helped when they broke up and Mick Jones started Big Audio Dynamite.
Which
And
was a
which
natural progression.
exactly.
For sure. So all you have to do is get out your vinyl copy of it and your cassette deck and pick enough songs to make to fill up one side of that 90-minute tape. There you have your 45-minute Sandinista. That's all you got to do, kid.
And I would definitely, I wish I was able to go and, like, trim Sandinista down into one album, and definitely, as I've mentioned many times before, The River as well by Springsteen, because I do think if you can trim out a bunch of that stuff, more is not better.
It depends, I think. It's not always better, and the knock on a lot of artists is that they can't throw out anything. And I think that's part of the knock of Sandinista or The River by some people. It's like, they overdid it or Bruce overdid it. Like, for example, on The River, when you are implying that it's not all top caliber Bruce material, are you talking mainly about side 4?
No, that'd be one thing. If it was just one side, then I would basically listen to everything but that side. It's songs sprinkled throughout, like "Ooh, ooh, I got a crush on you," um, and even Ramrod, and there's a few other songs on there like that. "I Want to Marry You," I think it's better than those, but still kind of a throwaway, and it detracts from the really good tracks, like The River, or like The Ties That Bind, or Point Blank, Fade Away, Independence Day, Drive All Night. Those are very powerful songs, and I feel they're lessened by the lesser songs. I think it takes away the impact of those songs,
Huh.
especially if one follows one of the other ones. So
I love those sprawling 2 and 3 LP sets. And I just I the songs you're talking about that aren't as good as, say, Point Blank, they still, for me, they still deserve a place in that package.
A- And so I'll say
And it's
two things
part of
about
the whole deal. Sorry.
no, okay. And I'll say two things about that. One is I wonder if you enjoy those two or three record sets more than I do because you don't have to go and switch to another album. It's just easier for you to flip sides or change records when because you're listening to vinyl and I'm streaming. And also as we talk about music, it seems you are far more accepting. I'm far more critical. And I wonder if that's also because you've been in bands and I haven't, and I've always been more of a critic. Um,
Mm,
so because when I'm railing about various things, you're more defending them. You're much except for the Stones later output. You don't seem to be as dismissive of some stuff.
oh, I have my moments, and other people who know me pretty well would probably say I'm very critical bastard and very judgmental when it comes to music. I just don't think we've touched on many topics that would lead me to really slam stuff other than like the later Stones output.
Okay, so someone like Springsteen or The Clash, do you think they made albums that just aren't that good?
Springsteen, absolutely. I
Okay.
I haven't liked any Springsteen record since The Ghost of Tom Joad, and I've given a fair shake to most of them. They all bore the shit out of me at this point. Um, there's
I
a
thought
few,
even please.
oh, there's a few good tunes here and there on stuff like Magic, that record, or the one it, that song Radio Nowhere. Which record is that on? Is that on Magic?
I think so.
But
I'm not.
anyway, um, I think yeah, since the Ghost of Tom Joad, Bruce has not put out a great record. And the Clash, the only really bad record they put out is when they really weren't the Clash, and that's that Cut the Crap
Yeah,
record,
which is
which
terrible.
yeah, everybody just spews so much hate to that record, and I've given it a fair shake even recently, and yeah, it's not good.
And as far as Springsteen goes, I felt Ghost of Tom Joad was a comeback album. I thought a few of the albums before that weren't that great. Not bad records, but not that interesting.
You're talking about like
Like
Human Touch and Lucky Town.
yep, and I like the song Human Touch, and there are a couple of songs I like on those albums, but I think they're overproduced. They're just a very different sound for Bruce, and I don't find them nearly as interesting as his best stuff.
And do you think that's also due to the fact that he had given the shiv to the E Street Band for those two
Absolutely.
records?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like he talks about in his autobiography when little Steven really wanted him when he was being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, regardless of what we think about it, is he wanted them to be inducted as Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, and Bruce thought about it and said, "No, I'm going in as Bruce Springsteen," and
That's seems like a very un-Bruce like thing to do.
and that's why it was so interesting to hear him talk about it because I listened to the audiobook as well and to hear him actually talking about that. um and I think that but I do think it was a mistake. I understand like Nebraska doing Nebraska by himself, that's a fantastic record. And
Maybe his best.
yeah, and that but one of the things about it is production makes such a big difference. It's such a sparse record and it works so well for the songs in Nebraska. One of the reasons that I'm not a big fan of Wild Innocent and the Street Shuffle, even though it's a good album, is the production is poor. And his first album, Greetings from Asbury Park, the production is terrible. I like the album because I really like the songs so much, but the production is terrible. And it wasn't until Born to Run that the production on his records was good. And so it was a combination of good records and good production that made such a big difference in my mind.
So again,
Yeah.
I gotta disagree with you,
Okay.
or at least not disagree, but I feel like the production on those first two records, Greetings and Wild and Innocent, is pretty poor. But I also feel like that is such a big part, that a big part of those records and the charm of those records is that um, they are relatively poorly produced, and some of the some at some points it almost sounds like some of those tunes are recorded on a 4-track.
Yeah.
But I like that quality for those songs, for those records, and it showed Bruce growing as an artist and as a producer and everything with Born to Run and then everything that came afterwards. But I actually find the poor production charming for those records.
And I get that. I don't quibble with that, because that's the charm to me. A lot of punk stuff, and certainly like in Liz Phair's Exile in Guyville, some of the Pussy Galore stuff. I like that, how raw it is. I just but it's interesting how, even though the first two Springsteen albums are both, in my mind, poorly produced, they're poorly produced in different ways, which is really interesting, because that first album is so, yeah, as you say, it sounds like it's on a 4-track. The second album doesn't, but it's still, you can tell like they're still struggling, and also change in band membership. So
Uh, yes,
because it wasn't until Born to Run, that the real E Street Band was established. So,
Vinny Mad Dog Lopez
yeah.
shown the door after Bruce's second record. Interesting how he talks about how that was one of the hardest things he ever had to do, because he was buddies with that guy, and like you become with your fellow band members, and you become good friends with them usually if the band is firing on all cylinders. And yeah, I could see where that would be a hard thing to do. And I also he speaking of Mad Dog Lopez, his drumming, it is really sloppy and compared to Max Weinberg, but it also has a lot of character, and it's a big part of the sound of those first two records, I think.
And it's interesting because you wonder how much Bruce writes with that in mind, versus it just is what it was. Because I agree with you, but like, could Vinny have played, for example, Candy's Room? Could he have played
Well, no, he
so
couldn't have,
yeah,
because he could not play straight like
yeah,
Max does. Um, that that would be interesting to hear some of those songs that ended up on Born to Run, because there's got to be recordings of them
right,
with
early.
Mad Dog playing on them. You would think, and I'm surprised they haven't shown up on some sort of bootleg or something. Hey, can we touch on a couple other bands and I'm curious to get your take on a few of the other bands I had listed as bands who've had an incredible run of at least 6. So we've talked about the Stones, um, and let's see, some of the others, the Kinks, right there with the Stones, in my opinion, or the Beatles or the Who, as far as incredible records, one after the other, and in that same sweet spot as the Stones or the Beatles or the Who, starting around 66, 67, 68, going to like maybe 72. And are you that familiar with the Kinks catalog?
No, yes and no. Like, I know Something Else, and a Village Green Preservation Society, Ape Man. I'm a Kinks fan without question, although I think Ray Davies is an all-time douche. But I'm definitely a Kinks fan. But I don't. I think that they're a notch below the Who, the Stones, from that era. I don't think their albums were nearly as good all the way through. But I think there's some songs that are just fantastic. Waterloo Sunset is one of my top 10 all-time favorite songs. So,
So
but more filler, or more songs that didn't hit the top than on like Stones albums or Who albums.
so why do you think Ray Davies is a douchebag?
Everything I've read, and like Nicky Hopkins talks about all the different artists he ever worked with, and he says Ray Davies is the only one he never would have worked with again. That a lot of the stuff that Nicky Hopkins did on Kinks album, there was one or two albums in particular, Ray Davies didn't give him credit and just took all the credit for his playing. Like, not only like not listed him, but listed Ray Davies as the person doing the playing.
I've never heard that.
Mm.
And I'm not doubting the validity, but I've certainly never heard that. And I've never heard that Davies was an asshole.
And so I'm sure if you Google it, and you can find stuff and all, and if you read Nicky Hopkins' autobiography, that's where I read about that, where he talks about that sort of stuff.
So I'm assuming you recommend that as a great read.
Not a great read, a good read.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So these are the records I'm talking about when it comes to the Kinks, and um, I I don't think there's filler on any of them. I think from start to finish, these records are all rock classics. Face to Face, Something Else from '67, Village Green Preservation Society from '68, Arthur from '69, Lola from '70, Muswell Hillbillies from '71. And also you could throw in a soundtrack they did called Percy from '71. Um, that also has some great songs on it. But anyway, those are the ones in particular that I was talking about. And I would urge you to go back and re-listen to some of those from start to finish. I'd be curious to see if you change your mind on those, because they're just so brilliant. All
What
of them.
one of the things I like about the Kinks is certain songs they did were songs it's hard to picture another band doing, like Village Green Preservation Society, A Well-Respected Man, Waterloo Sunset, as opposed to You Really Got Me or All Day and All of the Night, which could have been, any band. Um,
Yeah, and
you know,
that's their earlier
yeah,
period,
yeah,
which, great stuff for
yep,
sure.
yep,
But those are earlier records do definitely have tons of filler on them,
yes, yeah.
like
It,
early Beatles records.
I was going to say early Stones, early Who, early Beatles. I mean, that's how it was. You know,
Yeah.
I love that the Who's first album was called "The Who Sings My Generation." That is just such a misnomer. But I will listen to those Kinks albums. Like I said, that's one of the great things is I can just like this afternoon just cue them up and just listen to them all in a row. I do really do miss vinyl and having the vinyl in my hand and being able to read the back of the album and look at the pictures and the song titles then sort of also get more burned into my mind. I remember track listings better, obviously, when I'm playing a record as opposed to when I'm streaming.
When you're doing this while
Yeah,
listening to
yes,
the
that's when you
music.
you remember the track listings much more. And that's also the funny thing. The problem with re-releases is now when someone talks about like Revolver or something, they're including, for example, And Your Bird Can Sing, which wasn't on the original Revolver. And so, or
It
not,
was on
not the US release.
it was on the UK
Yeah.
release, yeah.
And so it's weird to have these re-releases because everyone's done them. And, if you're a rock scholar, you get confused, over what was on it and what wasn't. I'm sure they've done that with those Kinks albums as well.
Um, they have, some of them have been reissued, and it's usually an extra LP full of outtakes,
Yeah.
radio spots, live tracks, that kind of bullshit.
Yeah.
Like every company is doing for every band. With the uh, with vinyl getting popular again over the last 10 years, every label and their dog is reissuing whatever they can, and it usually the draw is extra tracks. Draw for somebody like me is tracks that didn't make a record or demos, that sort of stuff. A lot of times it's really just garbage, but a lot of times it's really good,
Yep. No,
depending on the record.
I'm sure you can find some gems. Interesting thing about the Kinks is so after, I don't know, 72, 73, they'd sort of just faded and they weren't even in the ether. No one was listening to Kinks. And then they released that live album. And then suddenly,
One for
boom.
the road.
Yep. And then like that was a massive resparking of their fame and potential.
That's a good point. And in fact, uh, that down period you're talking about, they were actually still active in putting out records every year, sometimes two a year. The difference was they just weren't getting any attention. They were these really, really what would be the word, oblique concept records they were putting out: Preservation Act One, Preservation Act Two, soap opera, Schoolboys in Disgrace, and they were somewhat difficult records to listen to compared to their earlier stuff, but they were still very active. It's interesting that um, you would put it as, oh, nobody was listening to them, or they weren't doing anything. They just had, for the most part, lost probably 75% of their audience. But those, again, I go back and listen to those records. They're really good records. They just, for whatever reason, were too difficult for people to absorb.
back then in particular, like there was no internet. And and even getting records wasn't as easy as it is now. And if they weren't getting radio airplay, people thought they were gone.
Yeah, especially in this country.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe they were still even in England, they really had a, a major down period until the live record you're talking about is called One for the Road.
Yep.
And the record right before it was Low Budget. And that was a bit of a comeback. There was the hit on that record was I Wish I Could Fly Like
Yes.
Superman. And that put him back on the radar. And then the obligatory double live record came right after it, and it had that rollicking version of Lola on it,
Yeah.
and
It's
then they were back in the game for a while
that is an anno
commercially.
that's an annoying version of Lola. I really dislike that. As opposed to
Everybody now.
their version of Catch Me Now I'm Falling, which is just awesome. But yeah, no, it's interesting, like, because I remember, like, with Low Budget, with I Wish I Could Fly Like Superman, that got radio airplay. That was a single, it got radio airplay. And then,
A
oh, the
lot.
Kinks, yeah. And it would be interesting if they'd put out One for the Road without having put that out first. Would they still have gotten the reception? Because that was sort of like a step up to help them. Without that, I've been curious to see what would have happened. So
It was a bit of a Kickstarter.
yeah, exactly.
And then after One for the Road, their string continued. Remember, Give the People What They Want had a hit,
Yep.
just that song Destroyer. The next one, State of Confusion, had Come Dancing, which was may have been their biggest hit single ever, you know?
And which one had Do It Again?
That's the record right after it, Word of
Yeah,
Mouth.
yeah.
So the parallel I see here is to Aerosmith, where Aerosmith had that major down period after, say, Joe Perry quit the band. They put out a couple shitty records with other guitarists, and then they had their big comeback. And then they were bigger than ever, commercially speaking, once Joe Perry rejoined. And um, that said, these Kinks records that came out and put them back on the map are not terrible, like those
Agreed.
later Aerosmith records, but kind of a similar trajectory.
Yeah. And they couldn't have. I don't know. They couldn't have put them out, but without One for the Road, they would not have gotten the airplay they got.
Yeah, I think you're right. Um, uh, another band I would be curious to see, or not even a band, but an artist. I think there's no doubt about Bowie falling into this category where he easily put out 6 amazing records consecutively.
That one I have no argument with.
So can we touch base on that run, or at least what I think the run is and what you think it is?
Yep.
I would start with I wouldn't start with Space Oddity. Maybe Space Oddity has some great songs on it, but really I see that starting with The Man Who Sold the World.
Right.
And do you know that record well?
Yeah.
Okay. And then Hunky Dory came right after that.
Great album.
I mean, there's no denying the greatness of those two.
Yep.
And then what's even more astonishing is he follows it up with Ziggy Stardust and Aladdin Sane.
Unbelievable. Ziggy Stardust is just a phenomenal album.
And then I guess this falls into the category we're talking about. Even though it was a record full of covers, it's still not a compilation. It's not a live album, which we don't include in this nonsense. Pinups came after Aladdin Sane. Great record.
Wonderful discovery back when I was buying vinyl. When I came across that, I was so excited, and I really like that album. One of the few covers albums I like.
Yeah. That'd be a good topic someday, is records by artists that we like that are all covers. Diamond Dogs came after that. Just not a stinker in the bunch.
And then Young Americans.
Yep. And again, completely different sound, completely different. than Diamond Dogs or anything he had done up to that point,
Yep.
but great in its own right. And it doesn't stop station to station.
Which is my favorite Bowie album by far. So,
Oh, really?
yep. I love that album. The title song is my favorite Bowie song, and the whole album is my favorite album.
It's fucking great, no doubt about it.
And Young Americans helped him become one of the first white boys to be on Soul Train.
Yes, that's
when he
right.
did Fame. Yeah.
Station to Station's followed up by The Hit Parade Does Not Stop by Low, and then Heroes,
And Lodger.
Scary Monsters, and then it all goes to hell.
Exactly, that's
Let's
it.
Dance.
Yeah.
So that's not only is that 6, that's about 12, isn't it?
And if you did include the live albums, his live albums are great.
Stage, yeah.
Yep. And Live at the Tower.
David Live, yeah.
No, he might. It's funny. He might have the greatest run ever of anyone.
I wouldn't disagree with you. When you had asked me a while ago what my favorite, we were talking about all-time favorite bands as fat white dorks do occasionally. Yes. And I think I said it was The Who. I wasn't really considering people like Neil Young or Bowie because they're not bands per se. I think we need to reframe that question. Yep. Who's your favorite music artist of all time?
Or also, who's your artist? Who's your band?
Yeah. So Bowie's definitely up there for me, especially when we just like line up all of those records